Good evening and welcome to Q&A. I'm Tony Jones. Joining us tonight, Cabinet Secretary Arthur Sinodinos, US journalist Christine Dolan, who co-founded an international coalition against children in slavery, former editor-in-chief of the Australian newspaper Chris Mitchell, Deputy Leader of the Opposition and Shadow Minister for Education Tanya Plibersek, and Emeritus Professor of Politics at La Trobe University, Robert Manne. Please welcome our panel. Thank you. Now, Q&A is live on ABC TV in New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania. It's live everywhere else on News 24 at 9:35 Eastern Daylight Time, or you can watch and listen live on iView, on Facebook and News Radio. First question comes from Jack Bresnan.
With the news this afternoon that the Solicitor General has resigned because of the broken relationship with the Attorney General, George Brandis, and the long-running feud between Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, culminating in a showdown over gun import restrictions last week and Liberal Party reform, is this further evidence that the Liberal Party, and in particular the Conservative factions, are struggling to unite under a moderate leader, or is tension like this simply business as usual for political parties?
I'll start with Chris Mitchell, because would it be interested to see how you had been reporting this if you were still the editor?
Look, I think they're very different sorts of subjects. To me, probably neither Malcolm nor Tony really wanted to change the gun laws. It seems to me Conservatives have fallen in behind Tony very quickly, but haven't really answered the question about how the gun law changes in August last year went through Executive Council, and Tony could still say on the 7:30 report last week that he didn't intend to change the laws. I suppose I also buy into the idea that politically Malcolm should have done nothing. He should have tried to reach out to Tony rather than tried to smack him down.
Here's something you said to Tony Abbott in a private conversation which you've recently reported. You're running a shambolic show. Is that also true of the Turnbull government?
It appears to be, doesn't it? It appears to be. I guess.
What do you make of the Justin Gleeson affair?
I think Justin probably did the right thing. It seems to me that he is a good lawyer, but of an activist bent, much like Gillian Triggs. He comes from a blue blood sort of Labor lawyer's background, which is no bad thing. But I think given the breakdown in relations between him and George, probably going was the right thing to do.
And just one last quick question before I move around to the other panellists. Do you see any? You mentioned that it does appear to be shambolic. Do you see any risk at all in all of this to Malcolm Turnbull's leadership?
Look, my feeling is that Tony probably isn't somebody who could rally the numbers. I think the chapter in my book is Tony Abbott Rudd Redux, so perhaps I thought at the start of the year it may go there. But he seems to me to be somebody who's probably just trying hard to push the Conservative case inside the party, but I can't see the party going back to him.
Arthur Sinodinos. I imagine you can't see the party going back to him.
Well, it's a very good question, Jack, but I agree with Chris that they are separate issues. But in relation to the party and all the rest of it, the background to this is that for a long time the Liberal Party has been a coalition of different strands. There's a Conservative strand, there's a small L Liberal strand, and then you add the National Party, which is slightly further to the right, or a lot further to the right, depending on where you stand. So it's always been a coalition of those sorts of interests. So for a long time, there's always been toing and froing over the emphasis between the different parts of the party. And what's happened is that you now have a Prime Minister who preeminently is a moderate, and also someone who didn't necessarily spend a great deal of time in the party organisation. He's been out there and done other things. You then have him straddling the various groupings and trying to bring them together in a way which I think provides a more contemporary narrative to what the Liberal Party is about. One of the reasons I supported him becoming Prime Minister in September of last year is because I think he can take the coalition forward in a stronger, better direction, which is also a more centrist direction. I make no apologies for that. At the end of the day, we have to be able to straddle the broad centre. It's what Tony Blair used to talk about, being a big tent. So we can't afford to be just extremely ideological or tribal and believe we can impose just one view of Australia on everybody else. Yes, we come to it with certain values and beliefs, basic values and beliefs we all share as Liberals. That's why we're in the one party, and we all make compromises along the way. But at the end of the day, it's about being pragmatic and governing for as many people as we can. And that's what I think Turnbull is fundamentally about. Do I think we'll ever go back to Tony? In politics, I've learned through bitter experience, you never rule anything in or out. But my view is that the party is moving on and that the younger generation of members coming through, including Conservative members, are looking at their own careers and their own future and how we make the Liberal Party narrative more contemporary.
So, Arthur, you don't rule out, specifically don't rule out Tony Abbott becoming Prime Minister again?
Look, as I said before, you never rule anything out in this business. If I had to put money on it, I wouldn't put money on it for the reasons I mentioned before. But I'm always careful in these things because in life I've learned in politics, it's the thing you least expect that can come back.
But you wouldn't have put money on Tony Abbott being ousted before he finished his first term?
Well, I wouldn't have put money on some of the things that happened in our first term, that necessitating taking the drastic action that was necessary.
OK, just a quick one before I go across the other side of the panel. How do you irretrievably break, this is about the Solicitor General, Justin Gleeson, how do you irretrievably break the relationship with your own Solicitor General without doing something wrong?
You're asking me about the Attorney General?
Solicitor General. I'm asking you whether the Attorney General has done something wrong that's caused the Solicitor General to resign.
If the Attorney General had done something wrong which necessitated his dismissal, the Prime Minister would have dismissed him. But I thought the way this was going to play out last week was that the Attorney General and the Solicitor General were going to seek to find a way through. But unfortunately what's happened is, because it's also played out so much in the media, the thing got a life of its own. And I think people were forced into positions which made a potential reconciliation more difficult. It's a bit like a marriage where it ends up being played out on the front page of the paper. It's much harder for people to retreat from certain positions. I know George Brandis quite well, and my impression is that George honestly believes that the issue over which they fell out was not quite as big as it seemed to be portrayed.
Right, let's hear from the opposition on this. Tanya, Plibersek.
Well, I think out of the Solicitor General and the Attorney General, certainly one of them should have resigned, but it was the wrong one that resigned. The office of the Solicitor General has been around for about 100 years. It's absolutely critical that the Solicitor General can give frank and fearless advice to government. The idea that the Solicitor General should have to go through the Attorney General to give advice to the Prime Minister, to the Governor General, to departmental heads, to ministers, is extraordinary. What if the minister that's going to the Solicitor General thinks that the Attorney General's corrupt? What if a departmental head thinks that the minister's acted outside their legislative authority? What if the Governor General thinks that the government's done something wrong? They should be able to consult the Solicitor General. And this comes after a long stream of mistakes and embarrassments by the Attorney General. He's taken on, as Arthur said, the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Commission. He appointed 37 people to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal just days before the last election, $370,000 a year jobs with no advice from his department, no information about potential conflicts of interest. I mean, that's extraordinary. We know at least 3 of them were Liberal Party donors. We've got an Attorney General who can't explain metadata when he's the minister responsible for introducing legislation on metadata. I mean, that is, even aside from the $100 million cut from the arts portfolio and put into a pot of money that he can feed to his preferred organisations, this man is an incompetent minister and he should have gone long ago. And if Malcolm Turnbull wasn't so weak in his own authority within the Liberal Party, he would be able to insist on better standards from his ministers. We've got a manager of government business that can't get the Parliament to sit when it's supposed to. He changes the sitting hours of the Parliament to accommodate the fact that members of Parliament take off. We've got a House of
Representatives... We've got a bit of a time limit on the show. I mean, there could be quite a few issues to go through, Tanya.
The list is a very long one.
It's not as bad as it is in America. It's not not as bad. No, we take the cake on this.
We'll come back to America and the cake that you've taken. Let's hear from... look, you probably do want to respond to that. That's a call for the resignation or the sacking of the Attorney-General.
Well, I don't think, as I said before, George has done something to justify his sacking.
OK, was it fair enough for him to issue an unprecedented direction requiring ministers to obtain written permission before seeking the advice of the Solicitor-General, an independent body?
Well, I'll back George's judgment on that. And frankly, I have no problem with that because in my experience, he's not the sort of person who's going to stop people going to the Solicitor-General. And he wouldn't stop the Governor-General going to the Solicitor-General, and he wouldn't stop the Prime Minister going to the Solicitor-General. But I think it's actually a good thing that George was asserting his prerogatives as the first law officer. I just think they allowed an issue like this, and this is where I've met Justin Gleeson. I quite like him as a person too. I think he's a good lawyer. I just think the whole thing was allowed to get out of control.
All right. Robert Manne, do you have a view?
Well, yeah, I do. On Justin Gleeson, if I was him, I would have resigned. Absolutely outrageous that a complete change in the rules of your office was done, obviously, without telling the Solicitor-General. It's such a simple issue. It's, you know, we've lost the sense of principles in Australian politics, but Justin Gleeson has acted out of principle. He was not consulted. You know, George Brandis said some nonsense about we have different dictionary definition. Here was a major change in the office, and no one disputes the fact that the Solicitor-General wasn't consulted. Could I also say something, and I just think he's a man of principle. I admire him. I didn't know anything about him until this happened. I admire him deeply for what he's done. I wish more people in public office would resign in such circumstances, and I hope public opinion is outraged, but I don't think it will be. Can I say on the Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull question, what I think is Tony Abbott is doing in public what Kevin Rudd did in secret. He's trying, he can't stop himself trying to undermine the Prime Minister. I thought actually, I had a strange attitude to the election. I'm, you know, not an insider like people here are. I thought the worst possible outcome was a narrow Malcolm Turnbull victory, because the narrow victory gave great power to the Conservative part of your tent. And that's what's going on, and Tony Abbott sees himself as a leader of that. I don't think he has a hope in hell of becoming Prime Minister again. I think he made such a fool of himself when he was Prime Minister. Everyone will remember Prince Philip being knighted and so on. I think, and Kevin Rudd didn't. I mean, I think he was, again, in secret, he was acting in a chaotic way, but no one, apart from people inside, knew about that. But Tony Abbott is publicly known to have made a mess of things in a comical way almost, and I don't think he has a chance. But he can't stop himself from trying to undermine the Prime Minister, and he'll seize on gun control, he'll seize on this, seize on that. And what's interesting is I know Kevin Rudd was doing it, but he kept it pretty much under wraps. I mean, he did it with me, you know, and I have no influence at all. But Tony's just doing it openly. And I think it'll go on. I don't think he'll succeed, but it will give some wind to the very reactionary parts of the coalition on gay marriage and many other things.
Let's move on, because we'll take the conversation in a slightly different direction now. We've got a question from Dylan Summerall.
Thank you. In the 2013 election, we saw the headlines and front pages of newspapers saying that we needed Tony Abbott. In the recent election, we saw newspapers positioning Turnbull as our hero. And in the Gillard years, I remember the articles saying, supporting the Ditch the Witch campaign. Does the panel believe that Australian media is playing too big of a role in our elections?
Chris Mitchell, start with you. And we'll sort of bring up your book here, because there's quite a few incidents in the book where you do play a role.
Sure. Look, I don't think, Dylan, that the Ditch the Witch thing had anything much to do with newspapers. You know, it was largely a 2GB campaign. And I think probably, you know, if he'd had his time again, Abbott would have never appeared near a sign like that. There's also, I think, questions about, you know, how effective campaigns, you know, by some of the tabloids were. And it seems to me the Melbourne and Adelaide News Limited, you know, tabloids were fairly straight. Brisbane and Sydney were not. I think the Oz was pretty straight in 2013. There was complaints about, how the paper handled the period, the 17-day period during the negotiations with Oakeshott and Windsor. But Julia rang me on the Friday and thanked me for the straight coverage.
It's funny you say Julia rang me, because there's a lot of incidents in your book where a Prime Minister or other rings you, and you gave plenty of political advice, for example, to Tony Abbott. You told him to demote Joe Hockey as Treasurer. You told him to reduce his reliance at the very least, if not get rid of Peter Credlin. I mean, is that the role of a newspaper editor, to be advising politically behind the scenes what Prime Ministers should be doing?
I think generally those sort of relationships, and they're not just relationships with me, I think they're across the media. And I think Prime Ministers do ring, they do ring and they do ask the question. Certainly I think, Robert knows that Kevin rang regularly, and I think he rang both Robert and me.
With me for no reason.
I mean,
Chris, can I put it, you mentioned Kevin Rudd, and of course he rang you before he even became Prime Minister with the request that you put out a news poll.
He did.
Working out whether he and Julia Gillard would do a better job of winning an election against John Howard than Beazley and his team. So, and you did that?
Yeah, well, we talked about the request, and I suppose I was sceptical about the idea of Kevin being able to form a partnership with Julia. Julia had greater numbers in the caucus, and I thought Kevin probably only had about 20, and I didn't see how that would stick together. But he claimed to be on the Great Wall of China with various grandees who could pull the team together. And I guess I think what I say in the book is probably in hindsight, it would have been better for the Labor Party and the country if Kim Beazley had remained Prime or leader, had won an election or not won an election, if it had been either Costello or Beazley. And it would have been better for Kevin and for Julia if they'd been front benchers in a Beazley government.
Well, strangely enough, I see Tanya Plibersek nodding as you were saying that.
I always thought that Kim Beazley could have won that election. And
Me too.
I think we would have had a period of stability under Kim. I don't think we would have won by the same margin, but I think we would have won. And I think both Kevin and Julia at that stage had a very legitimate aspiration to be leader sometime in the future. But I think for both of them, a period in a Beazley government would have been a very good thing, and I think it would have been a great thing for the country.
Let's go to the question that was asked, and really it was about whether the media plays too big a role. And I guess what I'm getting at here with Chris is whether editors of major newspapers or media organisations or powerful media players play behind the scenes too big a role.
Look, I think there's no secret that media organisations seek to influence election outcomes. I think you couldn't pretend that News Limited hasn't done that, and certainly a number of the radio networks are pretty plain in their advocacy for the Conservative parties. I don't know that it has the same effect that it used to have. Like, I really think that once upon a time, talkback radio and tabloid newspapers swung a lot of votes. And I'm not sure, I think, Chris, you might have observed this yourself, that in more recent years, because people are changing the way they consume media, they're buying fewer newspapers, they're getting media from different sources. I just don't see the strength of that influence anymore. We've had newspapers campaigning against us quite vociferously in election campaigns at a state and federal level, and they haven't really.
I'll just quickly throw back a brief answer on this, Chris.
Yeah, I guess it seems to me that it's a new phenomenon. It seems to me that neither Hawke nor Keating nor John Howard were as engaged with these kinds of conversations as the more recent leaders. And I think it's partly, 24-hour news, partly Twitter, the whole rise of social media, the preeminence of the daily messaging over the 3-year sort of horizon, and let's do 3 big things by the next election. And I think that's what's different in my 25 years.
I'll just, before I go to that side of the panel, I want to hear from Christine. Now, you're a journalist. In the United States, there are accusations the media plays far too big a role in politics. Most of them are coming at the moment from Donald Trump, who says the media is running a conspiracy against him.
The media in the United States has changed. When I was political director at CNN, I took my job very, very seriously. And the Fourth Estate has gone down the hill. It's not that we have a tension naturally between politicians and the media, and that comes naturally. The problem is this: in the course of the last, I would say, 8 years, that we have government officials threatening journalists. We have journalists not doing their jobs in terms of coverage. I noticed since I've been in the country for the last 2 weeks, every time that there was a WikiLeaks dump about the Clinton Foundation, there was a new Donald Trump chick, okay? And I think that in terms of networks playing bias...
So do you actually think the networks or the Clinton campaign's holding back these women and releasing them one by one? Is that what you suggest?
I'm telling you the timing is something that people should be very concerned about, because Donald Trump has been out there for a long time. Donald Trump, in January, a lot of people said in the States he's not going to get the nomination. What people don't understand is that there's a different culture in the United States. People are mad as hell. That's why Bernie had a lot of crowds. That's why Trump has a lot of crowds. We have a collusion of our government. There is no accountability, no IRS accountability. There's no congressional accountability. There's money in politics that's off the charts. I started covering politics. My first presidential campaign as a journalist was 1980. And today it is an issue. Anybody that says that you should raise $1 billion for a political campaign should be ashamed of themselves. Okay? And that's what happened in 2008. We had people in 2008 that wanted anybody but Hillary, who are now for Hillary, okay? We do not follow our lead in terms of politics and do not follow our lead in terms of the Fourth Estate, because we are losing morality and courage in terms of covering and holding politicians accountable.
Robert Manne.
Can I just interpret a bit more narrowly the question about... I'm actually a bit shocked at the amount, and Chris's book shows this, the amount of time that prime ministers, leading politicians, spent with journalists in a sort of semi-private way. My view would be that newspapers, in order to report objectively and fairly, ought to not have private relations with leading politicians at all. I think it makes the relationship very confused, because, you know, one minute you're palling up, drinking together, laughing, telling stories which will later come out in memoirs. And the next minute you're meant to be reporting on them. And I think that it would be much better to have a sterner kind of silo between editors of newspapers in particular and leading politicians. I actually would be surprised to know that Obama spent time laughing and joking with the head of CNN or the networks.
You'd be surprised, though, Robert. There were people that were invited into the White House who he met with on a regular basis, okay? So, and also, I mean, I always had a rule of thumb that, you know, after 2 drinks, everything's off the record. You're invited into the politician's home, that's completely off the record in what you see and what you report. I believe that you have to have ethics, because if not, then it hurts everybody else in the profession.
Yeah, we're going to come back to that question. I want to hear from Arthur Sinodinos. Are you surprised at the closeness, well, you wouldn't be because you're an advisor to prime ministers, but the closeness between prime ministers and big media players like Chris?
I think there's always been a closeness with media proprietors, going back particularly to the broadcast era, the Frank Packer era. You can go back a long way. And some prime ministers, Billy McMahon, for example, would have thought he could influence Frank Packer and therefore what the Daily Telegraph ran on their front page and all the rest of it. There's always this illusion that that's the case, but in my experience, newspapers are very careful about that. They're not just going to run something because you want them to run it. They've got to have an eye to their own reputation. There are some editors who want to be players, and I noticed in the last campaign some editors in some regional seats, for example, pushing very strongly for certain things to happen for that region. Now, they would say, I'm standing up for my region. But what they're doing is they're there as players, and they've got leaders of the opposition and prime ministers turning up. I have to say, as someone who's dealt mainly with the press gallery in Canberra, most of them I actually find pretty good to get on with if everybody knows the ground rules. And the ground rules are you shouldn't lie to them. Once you've lied to them and they found out about it, that's the end of the relationship. The other thing is always assume, even in a friendly encounter, that they are on the job. One of the worst things about being a journalist, it's like a drug. You can never be off it. As a journalist, you're always looking for where the story will come from. So you've always got to assume when you're talking to them, the possibility that you're giving them their next story. Some Prime Ministers thought that they could use the media to promote the policy debate. For example, Keating, when he was Treasurer and Prime Minister, effectively argued that the press gallery should be a cheer squad for economic reform. And he'd go out there or upstairs in the gallery, he'd show them charts of the J-curve on the balance of payments and explain why it would take time for a depreciation of the currency to show up in the improvement in the trade balance, all that sort of thing. So there's a bit of proselytising going on. And in turn, what I found in the Howard era was John Howard himself would deal with editors, but he very rarely, if ever, picked up the phone to an editor and complained about something. And the reason for that is, guess what? At the end of the day, the journo or the editor has the last say. They say what goes in the paper. There's no point.
Arthur, I'm just going to bring it back quickly to Chris before we move on to other subjects. But I think one of the most astonishing things I thought was Kevin Rudd contacting you and asking what industrial relations reforms your paper would support so that he could go ahead and create an industrial relations regime which you would back.
Yeah, no, I'd never seen anything like it either, and I'd agree with what Arthur said about both John and Paul. You know, I took it at face value. He was coming over to visit me that weekend, and so I called in Paul Kelly and Brad Norrington, and we had a bit of a chinwag about particularly personal contracts, individual contracts, and yeah, that's what I told him on the Sunday.
And did it end up in policy?
Yeah. It did, yeah.
Were you surprised?
I was very surprised that he asked, and it's never happened since, and it had never happened before.
Tanya, was that appropriate? Is that the way the Labor Party conducts its business, generally speaking?
Well,
to basically ask an editor what his industrial relations policy should be, then go ahead and change it.
The way we decide policy is through our national conferences and through our shadow ministers and our shadow cabinet processes. And it's an irregular way of approaching it, and I don't like.
That's a very modest way of putting it, Tony.
But I guess there's two things to say. I think that I think it was Tony Blair that said complaining about the way you get treated by the media is a bit like complaining about the weather. It might make you feel momentarily better, but it doesn't really change anything. So I don't see the point of people ringing newspaper editors or journalists saying, you've treated me really unfairly. I think it's our job to make a case for change. So what are the problems facing us as a nation? What is our idea about the best way of solving them? Building a consensus that this is the best way forward. And if I'm not doing my job of explaining the problems and the potential solutions and the one I've landed on well enough, then that's my fault. It's no one's fault but mine.
All right, we talked about Trump a little earlier. We've got a question along those lines from Stephen Weng. Go ahead.
It is easy to condemn the words and actions of Trump, Farage, or even Pauline Hanson, but much harder to actually confront the democratic processes that put them there without calling their supporters ignorant, racists, or to use the contemporary term, deplorables. How do the major parties seek to engage voters who are clearly alienated by their mainstream representatives?
Christine, I'll start with you because the basket of deplorables was something Hillary Clinton said about Donald Trump's supporters. Mm-hmm. Big mistake on her part?
No, I think it was conscious. I think it was practice. I think that she thought it through, and so did her staff before she actually said it. I don't think she thought that she was going to be... She said it before she was fundraising. Okay, and so then it was reported, but and she apologized for it afterwards. It doesn't get her any points whatsoever, but it might have gotten her points for the people that she was saying it before, which was the fundraising people.
Yeah, but what about the general notion that there are a large group of people out there alienated by politics as usual? This is one of the reasons why Donald Trump has made such an impact.
It's not just Donald Trump. You have to understand this, Tony. It's not just Donald Trump. Americans are mad as hell because of corruption. Americans are mad as hell because our foreign policy has gone in the wrong direction. People had a lot of hope for Obama. He was a guy who ran on an anti-war platform. And, you know, personally, I didn't think he could outdo Cheney. And look at the mess that we're in. I mean, these are conscious decisions. This was our U.S. State Department pre-Arab Rising, pre-Tunisia blowing up, pre-Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen. And our policy was that we were going to train people on social media to overthrow regimes. That's what happened. That's what people don't understand. Hillary writes about it in her book. She brags about it. And America's unconscious that these were not spontaneous. These were U.S. tax-paying monies, hundreds of millions of dollars, spent on training people in other countries to, quote-unquote, hold their governments accountable. And yet, look at the chaos that has happened that has had a ripple effect in Europe, across Central Asia, even down here with Nauru. So, I mean, you know, this is serious stuff. This is not just politics as usual in America. We're in the bottom of the barrel in terms of this. But we also give you Kim Kardashian, so why should anybody be surprised?
Arthur Sinodinos, go back to the general part of the question and, of course, the rise of Pauline Hanson, which is reflected in this feeling across the world that mainstream politics is failing us.
Yeah, look, I listened to her maiden speech in the chamber, and all you had to do was, you know, put a line through Asians, put in Muslims, and she took Indigenous out this time. It was essentially the same speech as 20 years ago. And those of you who may be familiar with focus groups, the way focus groups work is you sit there listening to what they've got to say and you get a distillation of views. And listening to her, I thought to myself, this is a bit like someone who is then replaying back to a group their views. And the only thing, as I suggested before, that's changed is some of the targets have changed. She's picked up on concerns today as opposed to the one she had 20 years ago. Well, 20 years ago, the way it was dealt with ultimately was to try and address the issues that were driving some of the people who felt marginalised or disenfranchised. And the view we took was not to take it for granted that there is some irreducible proportion of the population that is racist or something, and therefore we should ignore them, condemn them, let them go underground, whatever, but take the view that there might be ordinary people out there who, for whatever reason, are feeling marginalised or disenfranchised. How do we reach out to them? One thing Howard did 20 years ago was go to places in Queensland, outback places, where there were pig farmers who were affected by some liberalisation of pig imports at the time. It was an area which was quite big in terms of One Nation support. They had particular issues which had affected them. They had the Prime Minister go out there, do a town hall meeting, look them in the eye, and actually show, well, actually, as your Prime Minister, I get what the problem is. I'll do something about it. And we did do something about it. Now, I'm not saying that was a silver bullet. That wasn't the only thing that happened with Hanson. But you can't give up on the people who might feel attracted to her now because they somehow are alienated from the major parties. In the 2013 campaign, Palmer United Party was a bit of a vehicle for that form of protest in various parts of the country. And that, of course, imploded. At the moment, she has been gaining some momentum.
Well, momentum including 4 senators and a key...
Yeah, and what I was going on to say is that could play out in the Queensland election, and that is causing some ructions in Queensland at the moment.
So just very briefly, how would you now... We know what you mentioned the strategy for dealing with Hanson back then, 20 years ago, when the government had a full court press, if you like, against her. Tony Abbott roaming the country, working out ways to destroy One Nation, and ends up working out a case against her which puts her in jail. This is Tony Abbott doing this. Yeah. What do you do now?
Well, part of what you do now is what I mentioned before. And what we're doing in regional areas, including in Queensland during the campaign, is we announced all these regional job packages. So in areas where jobs are falling off, because, for example, mining is in a downturn and all the rest of it, we're trying to find ways to promote structural adjustment and make people more included in the growth that is going on. Ultimately, it comes down to bread and butter and basics.
OK, Tanya Plibersek.
Well, I think we lost about 53,000 full-time jobs last month. So I agree that it's about jobs, it's about people feeling economically included. I think the great inequality that we're seeing, not just in the United States, in Europe, in Australia. We have inequality at 75-year highs in Australia at the moment. I think that's a really significant driver. People's feelings of insecurity in the workforce, the fact that we're seeing We saw about $2.75 billion cut from TAFE and vocational education. So it's not just people's concerns for their own jobs, their own future, but they're worried about what kind of work their kids are going to be doing in the future. All of this plays into a feeling, I think, that politics is broken, that our most fundamental obligation as parliamentarians is to make sure people have a job, decent quality of life, food on the table, roof over their heads. If people feel that's broken, they start looking for solutions. And you've got a whole range of people who are happy to tell the public that there are easy solutions to these complex problems. There aren't. But decent work, health, education, services, that is certainly part of what we need to be offering.
OK, we've got a few questions to get to. We'll just sharpen up our answers a bit if we can. No, I don't mean sharpen them up in terms of content, but just duration. Chris Mitchell.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think across the world, it's economic growth and immigration. It's interesting that Robert's written this new book. I think people are scared of immigration now. I think it plays out in Brexit and in Donald Trump and in Hanson.
My quick thing would be 1996, Hanson rises because we've had a cosmopolitan Prime Minister in Paul Keating, in my view, and people didn't like him. But the kind of people that voted One Nation. Malcolm Turnbull, a ludicrous campaign, in my view. I'm sorry, Arthur. So, saying that what an exciting time we all live in, innovation, blah, blah, blah. Another cosmopolitan Prime Minister, seeing the world from the point of view of the affluent inner city and professional class and business class. I think it's very interesting. How you deal with it is very hard. The one thing I'm sure of is condescension is disastrous, which happened with the first time round. But on the other hand, to tolerate the depth of anti-Muslim rhetoric now would be quite wrong. So I think condescension is wrong, but principled opposition is necessary to the Islamophobic nature of what's happening.
Do you want to quickly pick up on that, Chris?
Yeah, because, the tone that we have in the United States is so ugly. And the discrimination is so ugly, and it's not just about the Donald Trump and chicks and what he had to say. It's also just the generalizations across the board. It's déclassé, it's ugly, it's not leadership. At the same time, what I see across the globe is where is the moral leadership worldwide? Okay, we've allowed it to come to this point, and I think it's up to the citizens. No offense to Arthur and Tanya, but in politics, the politicians work for us. Okay? We employ them. We vote them in. We either support their policies or we don't support their policies. But I think when you're talking about in countries like Australia and countries like the United States, we need to be better informed as citizens, and we need to demand more. It used to be that you'd have directors on corporations where people would say, hey, maybe we shouldn't make that decision for a corporation. We need to have citizens that say to their leaders, no, don't go down there. Because part of the reason why we have problems now, we're not having bigger conversations. We should be having, okay, nationalism, globalism. In the United States, we have people who actually say, we do not believe in borders. Now, Trump uses the word border kind of over the top. We can all agree on that. But our Secretary of State, John Kerry, brought up borderless about 7 weeks ago, okay? We have people who worked at the State Department that don't believe in the Treaty of Westphalia. So we need to be having conversations about sovereignty, not walls of borders, but sovereignty. We need to have conversations about capitalism versus socialism. I saw one of your shows here, and they were talking about same-sex marriage in Australia. Well, we have same-sex marriage. It went up to the Supreme Court, as everybody knows. But now we have morphed into a conversation in the States about no gender. I am neither a female nor am I a male, okay? That's a conversation you have to have. Is that where we're going? Our czar of the LGBT is now LGBTI. Now, that's not speculation. He was appointed by Obama at State Department, and it changed from LGBT to LGBTI. I had to literally ask somebody, what does I stand for? And then when they told me, I said, how does that work? How does that work? How does that confusion work? Okay? So I think that when we talk about policies in a country, we need to think bigger. We need to ask bigger questions as the population, because the guys and gals who make these decisions, they work for us.
Okay, that was a bit of a wild ride, and so I'm just going to quickly shift to a question.
American.
No, it's all good. Geraldine Waters has a question for us.
Yes. Just, I guess, leading on from the moral stance that you mentioned and accountability we should expect of our politicians. Who defines public interest when it comes to the private lives of politicians? How can journalists gain trust if they can't guarantee confidentiality? And then what happens to the truth?
Well, Chris, I think that's pointed to you, and confidentiality is a big issue related to your book.
Yeah, I mean, I think this country's never sort of had, Geraldine, the sort of issues that the UK does. So we don't really, intrude much on politicians' private lives. Tanya might disagree, but I think there's no great tradition of it. And certainly in my book, it's in the realms of tittle-tattle, really. They're amusing little stories that, they're neither national secrets nor about people's personal lives.
But did you have to think very carefully about the ethical considerations of journalists when you decided to reveal private conversations, albeit some of them took place a few years back?
Well, I suppose I took the view that the PMs concerned had left their jobs, and most of them had left politics, and I'd retired. I also thought there was a real point in it to try and give these people a human dimension. And I think I've also picked out certain conversations to show how my own thinking about the paper changed. So if you've been an editor...
Did you remember those conversations, by the way? Did you record them at the time? Did you immediately take notes?
I'm a pretty prolific note maker.
Kept notes.
So as everybody who's ever worked for me knows, I take a notebook to conference every day of my life. So, I think that we are better off without the deep intrusion into politicians' personal lives. I've seen, stories about lawyers going through other people's garbage, but maybe it happens on a current affair, but I don't think it really happens in the sort of journalism that the Australian or the mainstream media engage in.
Let's just go beyond politicians and your decision to reveal Rupert Murdoch's personal conversations with you after his really painful split up with Wendy Deng, his wife. You talk about his lonely, sleepless nights and the hurt he was feeling from what happened between Wendy and Tony Blair. Did you run that past Murdoch?
No, I didn't. Look, quite a bit of that had been published elsewhere. But look, I guess I felt that the person who I have worked for as a newspaper editor for a quarter of a century was nothing like the person being described, particularly after phone hacking. Now, Emma Albucci sort of, chipped me for not mentioning phone hacking in the book, but of course there was no phone hacking in Australia, so I had no first-hand knowledge of it. But to my way of thinking, Rupert is, a great Australian patriot and a great media man.
Yeah, but you went into the personal stuff.
I did.
That's going down into the weeds. That's him ringing you in despair, presumably, and you're now putting it in a book. Did you have to think twice about doing that?
No, it came about at a time where he was about to remarry. I think there were a lot of people who were surprised that he took up with Jerry Hall. There were family members out here in Melbourne who were very keen after Jerry Hall had been, acting in plays in Melbourne to get the two of them together. I think Rupert has a right to be happy, and good on him.
But doesn't he have a right to his privacy when he has a conversation with one of his editors who he obviously sees as a friend? I'm
sure he does. I'm sure he does have a right to that. I didn't feel I'd breached anything or written anything that he'd be unhappy with. Yeah.
Is he happy with it?
I haven't asked. I retired.
Well, you're still working as a columnist. He could, of course, cut your knees out if he wanted to, which he hasn't done, and that's a good thing.
I actually think, I have a private theory about this, I think it's remarkable how little intrusion there is into the relationship between journalists and politicians, apart from Chris. And I think the reason is that everyone in Canberra knows that if it began, it would never end. That there'd be so many stories to be told about the relationship between journalists and politicians and I think it's a very good thing. I think occasionally something is political, like Cheryl Kerno, Gareth Evans, and it moves from the private world to the public, and it's a hard judgment to make. But in general,
Did you, when you read Nikki Sava's book, presumably, did you judge that Credlin and Abbott fitted into that? Yes, that's all right. Let's go down that path.
Yes, I definitely think that that's all right to go, because, it was such a big political issue. It may well, when the historians come to write about the Abbott government, it may well be that the relationship with Peter Credlin is seen as the most important single cause of his downfall, when even Rupert Murdoch, it's an astonishing country, even Rupert Murdoch is warning Tony Abbott that he must do something about this. So that seems to me completely to fit in.
Let me just ask Chris about that. Do you think that's true, what Robert just said?
Well, look, I didn't go there in my book.
No, but I mean, whether that relationship, just talk about the political side of it, whether that relationship was the main cause of his downfall.
I think in February 2015 there was a spill motion that didn't succeed. I think Tony made it clear to the party room that he would change his relationship with Peter Credlin. I think he thought carefully about his relationship with Joe Hockey. I do spill private conversations about Joe Hockey, but I think they're quite amusing. It seems to me
that he was an unreliable prop forward in the seconds university team.
That Tony wouldn't pick him because he might have been drinking all night the night before and he mightn't show up. So I thought that was actually pretty moot to whether he should have been the treasurer or not.
You've actually suggested that was in the national interest that you reveal that. No,
I did.
I presume that's tongue in cheek.
Slightly.
Yeah.
But look, it seems to me that that Tony was well and truly warned and given a long time. And really didn't change his ways. So, and I think if he had changed his ways, he would have been Prime Minister still.
Okay. Arthur, I'll go to you. And at the general point, really, I noticed you didn't say anything interesting at all in the green room in Chris's company.
Look, can I say...
Joke, by the way.
And I think Tanya would be in the same boat on this. I think the time politicians get really angry is when their families are dragged into things. Because you feel, well, I've sort of volunteered for this and they're conscripts in a sense. The only time I've gotten angry is when my wife's been attacked in the paper. And I remember with John Howard, the one time he got really angry was the front page of the Daily Telegraph, which talked about his son being in a death house. He'd happened to have been in a place where something had happened and nothing to do with him. But it was the confluence of the name with the place. And he got really angry about that. And I think he probably did ring someone on that occasion. So that's the bit where you want people to judge you on who you are in your public life. Your private life impinges on that if you've done something privately which potentially has a public dimension to it. But other than that, you don't really want to be judged on your private life. And I think Robert's right. Once you go down this route, where does it stop?
Yep. What do you think about this from an American perspective?
I come from the school of Ben Bradley in terms of journalism. If a source lies to me, it's fair game. Fair game. Arthur's absolutely correct about that. We didn't start covering the private lives of, I guess in the full way that we do now until about the late 1980s when Gary Hart ran. It was the monkey business case that we put forward. And that was because Paul Taylor, a journalist from the Washington Post, said to Gary something about adultery and can you be president if you're an adulterer? And then basically he challenged the press and the Miami papers went after it. I think we've gone too far. I think it's gotten, if somebody's a pedophile, fair game, okay? Somebody rapes a kid, fair game. I think that when you cross over and you get into the private lives of public officials, then we have to take a look in the mirror as journalists because,
By the way, is Donald Trump completely fair game as far as you're concerned after the release of that video where he talked in such gruesome terms?
I think he was fair game when he said in answer to the second debate that he didn't grope women. Now, whether or not those women are speaking truthfully, I don't know. As a journalist, I question the timing of this because if they knew he was a dog, why did they wait till now? It doesn't make any sense to me. But I don't know. His
makes sense if
mouth.
They're worried about him becoming president.
Well, maybe so. But then again, what about Hillary
Clinton?
Hillary Clinton's not clean on this. You have to understand this. There are journalists that believe Juanita Broaddrick. Okay, and Juanita Broaddrick came forward in 1998 during the Monica Lewinsky scandal, and NBC News ran that story. So if they didn't believe in Juanita Broaddrick, they never would have ran it.
I think the reason that women are coming forward now is because they see Donald Trump on television saying, I never did these things. I never did.
That's right, and
and
he
if
said
you
that in
have
debate.
been the victim of an assault like that, to have someone saying, I've never done these things, would be a very strong motivator to set the record right. A lot of victims of assaults like this never report them to the police. They certainly wouldn't go to the media. But to have the person who's done it denying it in such a public way, it'd enrage you.
But so has Bill Clinton's denied it. He has denied it.
That's
and
not
he
the
has...
point I'm making. The point I'm making is you're questioning the timing of these revelations, and I'm saying the revelations are in response to his absolute denial, his assertion that he's never done these things.
Okay, Robert.
Well, I just think the timing is because of the groping video that we saw, and then one and another woman came out, and I think the ones that come out now want to, as it were, defend the ones that have come previously. And I think they're very honourable, because you'd have to be born yesterday not to realise what kind of pressure they'll now come under from the Trump. And I actually think that they shouldn't. A journalist can question everything, but I think their motives, at the moment, there's no reason to question them. I think they're very brave, and I think it's quite wrong to think that we don't need to know that kind of behaviour from someone who might be the most important leader of the world.
Okay, let's move on. Very different subject. Thank you very much. It's a question from Kelly Horan.
Yep. Teachers working in offshore detention facilities can face up to 2 years in prison if they speak out against the conditions in detention centres or provide information to journalists. Likewise, media access to offshore facilities is largely prevented. Despite these constraints, Four Corners went ahead with its program last week and has now been criticised for not telling the whole story. In making access to detention centres and their staff so difficult, are we basically telling Australia's free press not to report on what's going on?
Chris Mitchell, I'll start with you.
I think it's in the government's interest now to try to persuade Nauru to let more journalists in. Personally, I thought the program was okay. I know a lot of people in the media didn't like it, but I thought the testimony of the kids concerned was fair enough. I think the problem for the ABC really comes that the ABC has been seen to not report the wider asylum seeker story. So advocates tend to have a large say in the way the ABC has covered the story, and that goes back, I think, to the Tampa. So it seems to me that there would be very little problem for Four Corners had Four Corners been part of a wider mix of the way the story was covered over the last 12 months.
Quick one. If you, as editor, had been given the Nauru papers with the 2,116 incident reports, would you have run that? Would that have been a major news event for you?
I think undoubtedly everyone would, and I think it would have been no problem for me, because we've had, Chris Kenny on the island, and we've tried to, report. I think probably we went to Christmas Island more than any other media organisation over the last 15 years.
Okay, Robert Manne.
I think it was a great question. I think the Four Corners was a wonderful program. To see those fantastic young people talking in a way that because they're very intelligent, they understood what was happening to them, their spirits being broken by a policy of our government. I think it was one of the best accounts I've seen of the reality of Nauru now. I actually had a conversation, I won't say with whom, but a very prominent person not from Australia who is interested in offshore processing. And this person was astonished that a democratic country with a strong tradition of freedom of speech and freedom of journalism, astonished that the public has put up, really now for almost 20 years, with secrecy about what's being done in our name. They just couldn't understand it. It wasn't as if they were outraged, but they were. What they said to me was, how can a country like Australia have accepted that things like this can be happening on your watch, and citizens of a country, and you think it's okay, it's normal. It's not normal. And it's not normal to see those wonderful young people being destroyed in spirit. and in body, but in spirit. And I thought it was, I have to say, I can't believe that the program is, instead of thinking about what we're doing to the children, all the controversy is about the ABC. It's ridiculous. I mean, Peter Dutton shouldn't have been on. It was a beautifully crafted program. He could have been on later.
Let's, I'll quickly hear from Arthur and I'll come back to Chris.
Doctors are allowed to report. I think the young lady was up there.
She said teachers.
Yeah, teachers.
Sorry, yeah. But I'm saying in relation to doctors, where there may have been some moves to potentially gag people, that is not happening. So in relation to doctors, they are not in any way going to be violating the Hippocratic Oath or anything.
So what about teachers, like Arthur? Teachers
I
should
think
be able
people,
to speak? Social workers?
I think people who feel very strongly that they can't work there because of their conscience, because of what they've seen, well, they can resign, they can come back and they talk about what they've seen.
But having said, just very briefly, having seen those things, should they have the right to talk about them?
But the first thing we should be doing, if conditions are not as good as they could be, is try and make them as good as they can be. That's a separate question to, I think, where you're going, which is really, why should we have that regime of offshore processing? And the reason we have that regime is very familiar to people on the panel and elsewhere, because of our concern about having strong border control. And the issue that we face, the dilemma we face, that until we can find third countries that can take people, we will not be in a position to shut down this particular regime.
Well, there was one, New Zealand said they would take people.
Sure,
and
all of that will be taken into account. But both the Coalition and the Labor Party made it clear from before 2013 election that people who had come via boat would not be allowed to come to Australia, that we would process them and find other places for them to go. We are trying to permanently break this people smuggler business model, and then we will be freer to do even more in the refugee and humanitarian space.
Yep. Okay, that is a strong point. But that question was about the Four Corners program, which has now gone to air. Your communications minister is talking about having an inquiry into it. Peter Dutton is complaining that even though he offered himself up for a live interview in a non-live program, he should have been able to do that. You know, what's your view about the program?
Well, I haven't seen the program. I was doing other things last week.
We're happy to think it's called iView. It's really good.
Okay, sorry.
But I have read the Amnesty International report. I've met the people from Amnesty International who did the report. They were in my office in Canberra last week. I just didn't happen to see a particular television report on this. But the dilemma we face as political leaders is exactly what I said before. And if someone can come up with a better balance in this, which allows us to have strong border control, maintain strong support in the community for our immigration program, and allow us to further expand our refugee and humanitarian program, I would be as happy as anybody.
But would access to those locations to journalists, very brief answer on this, would that destroy the whole system?
No, I don't believe it would.
So should it happen?
Because I believe the people on there in the Department of Immigration elsewhere are trying to do their best in what are difficult circumstances to make the place work.
It's astonishing. John Howard, who I'm not the great admirer of, but when you were around, Arthur, John Howard brought people off Nauru and Manus Island quietly, kept the turn-back policy going, and it had no effect whatsoever in the people smuggling trade. And I can't, and you should know that because you were working with John Howard at that time, why doesn't this government think about history and think about the fact that these people could be brought off Nauru and Manus Island with our Navy still patrolling, and then this tragedy would be over?
I think, Robert, you've answered your own question. We were able to do it quietly, and we were able to get all the kids out of detention, and today all the kids are out of detention again. But the point was we were able to do it quietly. Today, you cannot do it quietly in the sort of 24/7 world we are in.
Well, wait a second, Arthur. That's like justifying kids being abused.
Just before you jump in, I want to hear from Tanya Plibersek,
thanks.
and I'll come back to
Tony,
you.
I think there's a few things to say about it. We're talking about the media elements of this. I think the first thing to say is it is unacceptable that more than 3 years later these kids are still on Nauru. We need to find third country resettlement for these children and their families, and Manus Island also. New Guinea's had a High Court case that says that those people can't stay there. So We had Malaysia, we've had an offer from New Zealand. We have to resolve this now. We also have to have much greater transparency. We should have mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse or neglect, not secrecy. Save the Children was kicked off Nauru by this government. Their contract was revoked when they raised concerns about children in the past. That should never have happened. The government should apologise to Save the Children for what they've done. We've got about 65 million displaced people in the world. Australia's cut our humanitarian intake rather than increasing it. We should be increasing it. Yes, we should be bringing people here safe.
We are adding to it.
You're not even back at you're not even back at where we were when we left government. We should have more people coming here safely. We should have greater transparency and accountability. We should have speedy resettlement of the people on Manus Island and Nauru. We should have a regional processing arrangement like we proposed with Malaysia that Tony Abbott, as opposition leader, and all his colleagues blocked. Remember that. So this area is an area of, I think, comprehensive failure by this government. And the Four Corners program, I can recommend, Arthur, that you do go back and watch it, because those children were very compelling witnesses for what's wrong with our system at the moment.
Okay, Christine. Arthur, I'll give you another chance to respond.
I have watched the news now for a couple of weeks about Nauru, and I had seen some of your shows in the past discussing Nauru. And I will tell you that the one thing that I find disturbing is that blaming one party over the other, one administration over the other. There is no sane reason on the earth for people. Everybody should be worried about terrorists, being involved with migrations. I totally agree with that. At the same time, no one should be silenced from reporting a child being abused. I don't care what country they live in, okay? I don't care what politician is in power. If a child is being abused, stand up and say something. Because if you don't say something, this is about you, not the kids, okay? Not the policy. And the politicians playing ping pong with child abuse is outrageous. You have 1 in 3 girls and 1 in 5 boys that have been abused in this country. We have 1 in 5 girls and 1 in 6 or 1 in 10 boys in our country. And politicians don't understand. There's a cause and effect between child rape and why people are in jail, why people are homeless, why people are dead, why people are in brothels. And it's about time that everybody get their heads out of the sand and understand, if you have a policy that says you're not going to take in boat people, okay, that's fine. It doesn't mean that you get to justify children being abused at a detention center.
All right, I'm going to get Arthur to respond to that.
The only further point I would make is that Tanya, in her answer, made it clear that essentially both sides of politics are saying the same thing. In the current environment, we can't bring them back into Australia. We have to find third countries, and that's what we're working on. Julie Bishop and Peter Dutton are working on at the moment. And yes, it's taken longer than it should have, but it is being worked on, and it will happen. The only other point I'd make about a teacher is that if a teacher or any other worker on Nauru feels strongly that something has actually gone wrong, I'm not saying that they should shut up and not say anything about it. They should. But the question always remains in those circumstances, what sort of chain of responsibility do you go through, and making sure that there's an appropriate chain of responsibility so that what they have raised can be acted on.
Okay, we're pretty much over time. Chris Mitchell wants to jump in.
Just 2 quick things. I'll just say Nauruans were, I think, offended by the program, and I think probably quite rightly, and it's not the place that, an 8-year-old child might think it is. And I think Tanya actually agrees with that. The other thing I'd say is I think a lot of politicians privately, but never in an audience like this, will say that they do know that these people have to leave Manus and Nauru. They know it, and no one will come out and say it because of everything that's happened since Kevin Rudd changed the policy, but that's their private position. And
do you think they should be brought off those islands?
I think they have to be. How long can they stay?
Should they be brought back to Australia?
Well, I think that needs to be decided.
Would you think that was a good idea?
I think Robert had a point. I think John Howard did bring them back. Yeah. I've read Robert's essay on it, and I think he makes a good point.
There has to be an independent children's advocate. There has to be mandatory reporting of suspected child abuse or neglect. There should be much better access for journalists. It's
We're over time,
impossible.
Tanya. So just very briefly, I'm sorry about this,
That's it.
but
All right.
what about that idea that they should be brought back to Australia?
I think we should be looking for third country resettlement. We've
So
talked
not
about New
Australia, so
Zealand,
there
we've
is
talked about-
bipartisanship on not Australia.
Well, I think it's a very difficult situation now, having for so many years made this firm rule.
Okay, that's all we have time for tonight. Please thank our panel, Arthur Sinodinos, Christine Dolan, Chris Mitchell, Tanya Plibersek and Robert Manne. Thank you. Now, next Monday, Q&A will be live from Mildura in the northwestern corner of Victoria with the Minister for Health and Member for Farrer, Susan Lee, the Shadow Minister for Agriculture, Joel Fitzgibbon, cauliflower grower and spokesperson for the Victorian Farmers Federation, Emma Germano, and the Executive Director of the Sunraysia Mallee Ethnic Communities Council, Dean Wickham. Now, before we go tonight, we just want to pause for a moment to remember someone whose work you see every week on Q&A, but whose name you probably don't know. Leslie Nassa was the engineer who created and maintained the system we use to filter, to moderate and show your tweets on screen. He was the inventive genius who made our dream of a truly interactive Q&A possible, blazing a trail that's now being followed around the world. Tragically, over the weekend, Leslie was killed by a hit-and-run driver in the United States. He leaves an enormous hole in our team. More importantly, he leaves a much-loved family and many, many friends. Our thoughts and our prayers are with them. Good night.